Good afternoon. I'm Ilsa Connect, and I'm the Deputy Director of Public Policy for the National Center for Victims of Crime. I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Serial Offending and the Testing of Rape Kits with Dr. David Lisak. I want to just tell you one thing about, on the side of your screen, you'll see one of the panels on the bottom is it's called polling panel. We have a little quiz there for you. We use this to measure learning learning after the webinar, so we do a pre-test and a post-test. If you don't mind taking that for us now, that would be great. I want to just talk for a minute about my organization, the National Center for Victims of Crime, before we get started with our speaker. The National Center for Victims of Crime is a 25-year-old national resource and advocacy organization, and we work to help victims of all types of crime rebuild their lives. We do this through advocacy for victims' rights, and we work to secure resources and protections for victims. We do this through federal work and state-level work, and we provide training and technical assistance to those who work with survivors of crime. We're very grateful to be funded by the Office on Violence Against Women at the Department of Justice to help communities create a victim-sensitive approach to sexual assault kit backlog problems and untested sexual assault kits. Those are the kits that are in law enforcement custody as opposed to sitting at crime labs awaiting analysis. Under the grant, we are providing training such as this webinar, technical assistance, for example, creating a victim notification protocol, and we are creating and have created an online resource collection that includes policies and protocols regarding victim notification and other aspects of working with victims in untested sexual assault kit cases. We are also obtaining perspectives from victims to ensure that our project is victim-informed and really is a victim-centered approach to dealing with this issue. Last year, we held a roundtable with survivors whose kits had been untested for many years, and we learned from them a lot about what was working, what had worked for them in their cases in terms of victim notification or their involvement in the criminal justice process after their kit was tested, and what didn't work and what they think should be done better. So a brief report of that is on our website, and we are now interviewing victims across the country about their experiences, and we'll be doing write-ups on those cases, and those will also be on our website as well. We have an upcoming webinar we want to tell you about. We're very excited in our webinar series to have Kim Worthy from Wayne County, a prosecutor in Wayne County, and she'll be talking about cold case sexual assault prosecutions. And this is the Detroit Backlog project, basically under the funding from NIJ, and she'll be talking about their experiences and what they've learned there in Detroit with their untested kit project. That's March 14th at 2 o'clock p.m. That information will be on our website soon, and you'll be able to register from that from our website for that webinar. This is our website, and it's the DNA Resource Center at the National Center for Victims of Crime. We have information about this project as well as other DNA-related projects. We have over 20 archived webinars related to topics on forensic DNA and DNA databases, and a whole host of other resources for you here. So check out that website, and you can find out about our upcoming webinars there as well. Here's my contact information. We are on Twitter if you want to follow us there. And if you have any questions, you can feel free to email me or give me a call. Okay, on to our most accomplished speaker. I'm very excited. We've been talking about this webinar for, I think, maybe almost a year. So I'm very excited this is finally coming to be today. I want to tell you about Dr. David Lisak, and then I'll be able to hand the floor over to him. Dr. Lisak is a researcher and forensic consultant who, for 25 years, has studied the causes and consequences of interpersonal violence. His work has focused on the long-term effects of sexual abuse in men, the relationship between child abuse and violence, and the motives and characteristics of rapists. Dr. Lisak has served as a consultant to judicial, prosecutor, and law enforcement education programs across the country and has conducted workshops in all 50 states. He consults widely with universities, the force services of the U.S. military, the Department of Defense, and other institutions regarding sexual assault prevention and policies, and frequently serves as an expert witness in homicide and sexual assault cases. Dr. Lisak is a founding member of 1 in 6, a nonprofit agency that serves men who were sexually abused as children. So I am looking very, very forward to this webinar and learning a lot, and I am handing it over to Dr. Lisak now, and we'll have questions after he is done speaking. Oops, I'm sorry. I think we're having a little audio. Looks like he's muted. There we go. Dr.
Hello.
Lisak? Oh,
yes.
Good, good. Hi.
Thank you. Thank you, Ilsa, and thank you, Tori. I'm delighted to have this opportunity, and good afternoon, I guess, to most of you. Those of you in California, good morning. I'm going to talk for somewhere around 45, 50 minutes or so. I would really dearly like to leave enough time to handle some questions and answers at the end. And so thank you all for attending. This is, as I'm sure all of you know, this whole issue of the testing of rape kits and the backlogs that exist in many jurisdictions is something that is tremendously vexing in so many levels. And before I get into some of the technical aspects and some of the sort of the well, I don't know what you're going to call them, the very specific issues that arise from rape kits and DNA testing and whether or not it's tested. I want to mention one kind of overarching issue, which we can sometimes lose sight of, because we get, all of us are professionals, we get kind of caught up in the details, and that is the impact on reporting rates, the impact on victims around the country of hearing and of knowing that jurisdictions are not testing rape kits, are not handling rape kits with the kind of diligence that we would expect from the criminal justice system. And it is simply it's an impression issue, but it's it's an impression that can have a tremendous impact, and we already have an enormous problem with reporting rates, and the fact that such a small percentage of victims of sexual violence report. We need to be doing everything possible to encourage reporting and to provide an atmosphere, frankly, a larger culture in which reporting is invited. And I think this is just one other issue, one other aspect of the criminal justice system that serves to suppress reporting because of the impression that it creates. So I'm going to begin with kind of an overview of the role of identification data, DNA, other forensic kinds of evidence in both non-stranger and stranger cases. And we'll start with non-stranger because it's I think we're all familiar with some of the key reasons that DNA and other kinds of forensic evidence is so important in stranger cases. So in non-stranger cases, a lot of people kind of begin with the assumption that most of the biological evidence that we collect, especially DNA, is really irrelevant since literally by definition, if it's a non-stranger case, the identity of the individual, the perpetrator, the alleged perpetrator, is known, and the issue, of course, 99% of the time is simply consent. However, as we all know, very often the issue of whether or not there was sexual interaction or what kinds of sexual contact there were is often not clearly essentially stipulated. And DNA evidence can actually accomplish that. And in fact, there are many cases, one very, very famous case, of course, the Kobe Bryant case, where his initial response to being contacted, he was contacted first by law enforcement, was that there was no sexual contact. And when the officers who were doing that interview essentially intimated to him that, well, they had biological evidence that indicated that there was, Bryant fairly quickly changed the story and acknowledged that there was sexual contact, but of course asserted that it was consensual. So DNA evidence, and in that case, actually the bluff of DNA evidence, can actually move a case along. And to the extent that a defense is going to sort of put up various kinds of barriers to prosecution, that's going to be one of them. The first, if you can deny altogether that there was any kind of sexual contact, that's a sort of an easier defense. So biological evidence can move past that point. And then there's another aspect and another way in which DNA evidence can actually be quite relevant in a non-stranger case. And I'll talk in a little bit more detail about a specific case that I worked on where this arose. But as we all know, very often in both stranger and non-stranger rape cases, the victim has sometimes very real gaps in memory, and very often very fragmented memory. And sometimes that is purely caused by the trauma of the sexual assault. Sometimes it's caused by alcohol intoxication. Sometimes it's caused by other kinds of intoxicants or drugs, whether they were voluntarily ingested by the victim or not. And so in those cases, DNA evidence can actually help map what the specific sexual acts were. And that can have a very important impact on the case, both the case in chief and then oftentimes in terms of charging and if there's a conviction, then also in sentencing. And as I said, I'll describe a specific case in which this was the case in more detail a little bit later. And then there's this is often referred to as the CSI effect. There's the sort of painful reality that because of the proliferation of TV shows about various kinds of, essentially forensic, the sort of forensic aspect of the criminal justice system, it is become essentially part of our popular culture that DNA and all kinds of other very sophisticated, sometimes almost imaginary forensic analyses are possible, and it is, prosecutors, I'm in touch with prosecutors all the time, and I'm not saying that this is an epidemic, but it is certainly the case that you have to be wary, or at least aware, that you may have jurors who are expecting biological evidence, forensic evidence, DNA evidence, and regardless of the fact that in a particular case, it may be logically irrelevant, that doesn't matter. As we all know, jurors nullify verdicts for all kinds of less than logical, frankly, very irrational reasons, and this can be one of them. So another reason for collecting DNA evidence is simply to block that additional avenue whereby a verdict can be derailed by jurors' expectations. And then finally, this is a really critical one. When you test rape kits, when you gather the biological evidence that's in them, and you catalog it, you create a database. And what I'm going to be spending most of this time talking about are the data we have about serial offending, and we are doing, frankly, as a whole, as a culture, whether you talk about the civilian world, the military world, higher education, we are doing a frankly very poor job of tracking serial offenders. We're frankly doing a very poor job simply of investigating cases, not only the incidents themselves, the alleged incidents, but also the alleged offenders. And we desperately need to start improving that. And so we need all the databases that we can possibly have available to investigators so that they can start looking at, in every case, checking on these databases in order to ascertain whether or not the suspect that they are investigating has been involved in other cases. And there's much more that can be said about that. But I'll continue on now to stranger, and here I think we can spend less time because they're as I think they're more obvious. In the stranger case, of course, very often the assailant is unknown, and therefore DNA can identify the assailant, even if it cannot immediately pin a known identity on the individual and the perpetrator. Obviously, the whole purpose of DNA and its strength is that it's a marker for an individual, and many cases, serial cases, have been solved by matching DNA across different crimes and identifying serial assailants that way. In stranger cases, of course, the argument for the gathering and the catalog of biological evidence is very clear-cut. Obviously, it can also confirm a suspect. So I've worked on many cases where initially we had a suspect, but we did not have clear evidence that it was that particular individual, and DNA, certainly the power of it is that it erases that uncertainty. And then like non-stranger cases, again, victims of a stranger assault very often also have fragmented memories or memories that have been wholly erased or inaccessible because of intoxication or drug contamination, and there too DNA can help us map out what exactly occurred, which obviously has a tremendous impact on both how the case is put before the jury and also in sentencing, charging and sentencing. And then, like non-stranger cases, DNA creates a database for reference for future cases. And here, the sort of the last point I want to make about this slide is I have stranger and non-stranger here nicely, cleanly divided into two columns, as though these are absolutely separate entities. And let's please remember that there is far more crossover across these two categories than we often acknowledge or think about. So we know there are stranger rapists whose mainly, if not apparently exclusively, target individuals who they have no prior acquaintance with. But we also know from many, many cases that there is far more crossover than we realize. And so when you look at the reasons for DNA analysis in stranger cases, and again, these are obvious that we need all the biological evidence we can possibly gather for those kinds of cases. Let's remember that we know the vast majority of these perpetrators are serial offenders, and just because they may be involved or we may be investigating a case that is a stranger case, that does not mean at all that this is not an individual who would also commit non-stranger assaults, and vice versa. So that's a really important thing to remember, that these are not sort of different species. These perpetrators target vulnerable individuals, and very often their choice of victims is dependent on who they have access to. So I want to talk now very quickly, focusing more on non-stranger cases, about some of the misconceptions, and I'll do this fairly quickly. In non-stranger cases, there is a really prevalent, essentially it's a mythology, and it really applies both to victims and to the perpetrators of non-stranger rape, which is often, unfortunately, still referred to as date rape. And with regard to victims, of course, the mythology is that a victim of non-stranger sexual assault is not as severely harmed as a victim of a stranger assault. And I think I'm probably talking to many of you who are very aware of the research on the impact of rape. And if you look back over the last 20 years, the vast majority of that research, and we have some very good research now on the impact, medium-term, long-term impact of rape. Almost all of that research now is done on random samples of victims of sexual assault from across the country. And when you do a random sampling like that, you get about 85% victims of non-stranger rape. So the fact is that the very database that we use to understand the impact of rape comes from largely the study of non-stranger rape victims. So that myth that they are not as severely harmed is completely inaccurate. And that same myth, of course, applies to the perpetrator. And here there's this very prevalent sort of misconception that in non-stranger assaults, this is kind of a whole different category of crime. It's a whole different category of offender. Lots of times jurors, really focus on the fact, well, he was drinking, as though somehow this is basically a decent individual who wouldn't do this kind of thing normally, but he was, too intoxicated. She was very intoxicated. There was miscommunication between them, and they really often look at it as a kind of an accident of circumstance because they don't want to see this individual as a real criminal, as somebody who really with intent and with malice was capable and is capable of committing this kind of a crime. And the reason I have on this slide, basically a nice guy, is because in talking to jurors, you hear that over and over again when it comes to non-stranger rapists. And so I'm going to go over now some of the data we have about these very individuals, these men who commit non-stranger sexual assaults, and it really completely contradicts that myth that I've just been talking about. So let's start with just some key facts about the frequency with which this occurs. And we know that, and I guess this is some good news, is that, and it depends a little bit on whether you are basically an optimist or a pessimist. Maybe you look at these numbers and you can either be horrified or grateful. About 5% of men, and here these data are almost entirely from college samples, so samples of college males. And we do have some sampling from the community, but very, very few studies and not enough really to draw any conclusions. We also have data from the military, but specifically from naval recruits, and those numbers are considerably higher. So the vast majority of what we have in terms of data, this is from college samples, and about 5% of men in college admit to committing acts that meet the legal definition of rape. And about 3% are serial, have committed either 2 or more, or 3 or more, depending on the definition by the researcher. So as I said, you can look at those numbers and sort of either feel reassured that 95% of men don't, or you can look at those numbers and multiply 5% by any community population, and you do have a large number. So there's validity if you want to be optimistic, and there's validity if you want to be pessimistic. So I want to now look at this phenomenon of serial offending, because this is something that we have known about for decades, and not only when it comes to rapists, but also to really almost every category of violent crime. And it's something that really has enormous implications for how we respond as a criminal justice system to this crime. So I'll start with a study that we did in the Boston area, in fact at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And we gathered data from almost 2,000 men, 1,882 men. And in that group of 1,882, there were 120 rapists. And again, the methodology is really identical to the methodology used for probably more than 20 years now. Those of you who are familiar with victimization research, you know that when you're asking individuals about their history of either sexual assault or domestic violence or child abuse, you don't ask, have you ever been raped? Have you ever been sexually abused? You ask questions that are behaviorally explicit. They're quite graphic questions, very unambiguous, but you don't use words like rape or assault or abuse. Well, when we assess perpetration, we do exactly the same thing, the same methodology, but of course we're asking about behaviors that they have acted, have committed. And we use multiple questions. I think in this study it was 7 questions that related to sexual assaults of adults. And I'll show you in a moment, we also ask questions about other kinds of perpetration. So in this study, of those 120 rapists, 63% were serial offenders. So almost 2/3. Now, if you look at the this study as a pie chart, first thing again, the vast majority of men in the study had not committed a rape. 1,762 out of 1,882. And I'll add one more reason for a little bit of optimism or some good news, which is this, that as you'll see in a moment when we start to talk more in detail about the serial rapists, one can be quite secure that the vast majority of that group of 1,762 men, not only have they not raped, but it's at this point, the mean age in this study was about 24, almost 25, and it's actually quite unlikely that they are going to commit a rape at this point. Certainly not become serial offenders. And so, we can look at that pie chart and feel like, well, those of you who are involved in prevention work, that's an awful lot of individuals. That's certainly the vast majority of that population who are out there and can be educated and mobilized, recruited for various kinds of prevention efforts. The yellow slice are the single act rapists, or whatever you want to call them, individuals, men who've committed a rape, but not before, not after. And it's possible that some of these men, sort of slip past us in terms of the number of rapes, but it's clear that there are men who don't have this history of committing rapes. And for these individuals, and this is really anecdotal evidence, their participation in rapes appears to be more as a result of circumstances, situational factors. They are clearly quite different from the serial rapists. So you look at the serial rapists, this is now 76 men who committed 439 rapes, a handful of attempted rapes. And these are the individuals who we actually know a lot about, just not from this kind of sample. This was college students, obviously. There's a very similar study, which I'll go into in a moment, from Navy recruits. These are very familiar numbers if you look at criminological research, going back about 50 years. So I'm going to dig a little bit deeper into the data that we got from this Boston sample. As I mentioned earlier, we not only assess rape, we also assess sexual assault, which is non-penetrating acts of sexual contact through the use of force or threat of force. We also assess sexual abuse of kids, physical abuse of kids, and domestic violence. And all of these categories were assessed in the same way, with multiple questions, very graphic, very behaviorally explicit questions, but never using sort of keywords like abuse or assault or things like that. So what we found is that the 76 serial rapists were not just rapists. And this, too, is frankly very consistent with criminological research that has been done really around the world. So in our study, those 76 rapists, in addition to the 439 rapes and attempted rapes, also committed 49 sexual assaults, 66 acts of physical abuse against kids, 277 acts of sexual abuse, and 214 acts of battery. It's an awful lot of violent crime. In fact, 1,045 offenses committed by just those 76 serial rapists. And here I have to remind everybody that these are students. These are college students we're talking about. These were startling data, I have to admit, for me, when they appeared on the computer screen. And they were startling because, again, it's a schema issue that we have this category, that we have historically referred to rapists. Oftentimes really meant stranger rapists, and nobody is surprised to find out that stranger rapists are often serial offenders who rack up many different kinds of victims. And it's simply the case that it applies as well to college students. It applies as well to men in the services. So it's a phenomenon that we're familiar with. We just simply have to apply the schema across the board. Just another slide to capture this phenomenon of serial offending. The serial rapists, on average, had 14 victims. That's victims of rape and sexual assault, of course, but also child abuse and domestic violence, so different combinations. And clearly, these data were gathered now about 12 years ago. If I could go back sort of and do a longitudinal sort of reassess these individuals now 12 years later, I think we can all imagine how many rows of victims we would have here on average for every one of those serial offenders, because we know from all kinds of other sources, and much of this data coming from sex offender treatment and management programs, that sex offenders tend to have a long career of offending. Those offenders who target, especially in non-stranger kinds of scenarios, we know that victims are very unlikely to report. So the odds of getting caught, the odds of being prosecuted are really low. When we do catch up to these individuals, if we're lucky enough, if we get a victim who reports, if we get a case that is well investigated and prosecuted, we get a conviction and the person ends up in some kind of sex offender program, that's when we start to find out that this individual has been offending for oftentimes decades. So there are many, many famous cases. Of course, the Sandusky case that we all either went through or witnessed fairly recently was a great example of that. We know from many of the clergy abuse cases that oftentimes those offenders have hundreds of victims. And in fact, we have research going back to the late 1980s and early 1990s, where researchers like Abel and Weinrott and Saylor actually documented the fact that both rapists and other forms of sex offenders typically rack up really startling numbers of victims. And this is, of course, what really underscores the importance for the criminal justice system to maintain the most effective databases possible, so that when we have an investigation that is launched somewhere in the country, that investigator has at their disposal the best possible databases so that they can determine whether or not they're investigating somebody who's actually a serial offender. It would be great if we started catching some of these individuals and finding out that they're serial offenders in the course of an investigation rather than years later when they're finally put in a sex offender program. So I mentioned earlier that there's essentially a replication of our study at UMass Boston was done in the U.S. Navy. This is at the Great Lakes Recruiting Center, where they've been doing research, very similar research to this perpetrator research that I've been doing and other people have been doing. And so they published in 2009 a study looking at serial offending amongst these Navy recruits. And in this sample, there were 1,146 men. 13% of them were rapists, and that is a substantially higher number than we find in college samples. One thing I want to alert everybody to is that at this point, there's no way we can extrapolate or generalize this beyond, frankly, the Great Lakes Recruiting Center. We can't even generalize it to the U.S. Navy, let alone to the other services. It would be great if we could get more research from other branches of the services to find out if this pattern of higher rates holds true. In their study, 71% of the rapists were serial offenders, compared to the 63% in our study, and they averaged 6 rapes each, which was exactly the same number that we found in our study. Not surprising, because the age of these two samples was very similar. Now, one of the interesting things that they did in the McWhorter study is they assessed these men at 2 different points in time, when they were first inducted into the Navy and then a year later. And here's what they found: that men who'd committed a rape prior to entering the Navy were 10 times more likely to commit a rape during their first year in the service. And it's a fairly startling finding, but actually it's a very simple finding in some ways, and all it really means is that indeed these were sex offenders, because what we know about sex offenders is that they tend to begin their career of offending when they are essentially in adolescence. So prior to entering the Navy, prior to coming to a college, or university, and they simply continue these sex offending behavior in this new environment. So it's an underscoring of this phenomenon, but it's also a reminder that we're talking about sex offenders, whether we're talking about college students, university students, men in the services. We have a small number of sex offenders who are coming into these environments, and they are committing these offenses repeatedly. And again, this underscores the really desperate importance of understanding the phenomenon as a serial phenomenon, and therefore putting in place the mechanisms whereby investigators can really dig deeply into the backgrounds of individuals and have access to as many different databases as possible, so that we can increase the likelihood that we identify the serial offenders, and that we do so in the course of these investigations. This is, very quickly, this is a 2008 Department of Justice study, and I just want to put up a graph here just showing the onset, the average onset age for sex offenses by sex offenders, of sex offenders. And you can see it's right around 16 years of age. The one thing I want to caution people about with regard to this graph is that this is clearly our best data indicates this, and there are many studies that converge on approximately the same age range. The one caution is this: it's very difficult, as you can well imagine, to gather data on this type of offending in middle schools, and because of that, really we are basing our estimate of what the age of onset is. We do have some data from sex offender programs, sort of retrospective, but we're lacking data from younger population samples simply because it's almost impossible to do this kind of research in middle schools. So we have to. I just always look at this and look at it fairly tentatively. The age of onset for some of these offenders, I'm quite sure is younger than 15, 16, and we have less data as you go farther back in time to younger samples. So looking at these two studies I've just been describing, the study we did in 2002, or published in 2002, and the Navy study, you can see the two different, slightly different percentage of serial rapists, but the bottom statistic is the one I want to bring our attention to and focus on just very, well, I guess somewhat quickly. One is, in our study, 91% of all the rapes that we tapped into in our sample were committed by serial rapists. And in the Navy study, 95% of all the rapes were committed by serial rapists. And there's a really, I think, profoundly clear implication of this. And that is that every single time we get a report of a sexual assault, we really need to be running two investigations. One is an investigation of the alleged incident, where we systematically gather evidence, at first to determine whether or not charges to be filed, to determine whether or not the case could be, proceed forward towards prosecution, and that's, we're all familiar with that. But the other investigation needs to be, who is this individual who's alleged to have committed this act? And there, when you have data that tells you that north of 90% of all sexual assaults are perpetrated by serial offenders, every single report is an opportunity to potentially go after one of those serial offenders. And we are, at the moment, very, very few jurisdictions are adopting this approach, even though there's nothing revolutionary about this. Think for a moment, do this thought experiment. If an individual comes forward, and let's talk about in a college situation or in the military, and reports that last night in the dorms an individual tried to sell them a vial of crack. Well, there would be a criminal justice response. But that response is actually not going to focus first and foremost on whether or not it's possible to prove, whether you can gather the evidence that an attempted sale of crack was made at 10 p.m. in the dorms last night. There may be, you might look for some evidence, maybe you got some video cameras or something. But actually, the more serious investigation will be, is this individual who's alleged to have made this attempted sale, is he a drug dealer? And when we use the term drug dealer, of course, what we are meaning by that is he a serial seller of drugs? And we do that routinely. We do that, in fact, automatically, because we understand that the more serious risk to the community there is that there is a drug dealer in the dorms. And the evidence in sexual assaults is every bit as compelling, and yet historically we have not adopted that same strategy. We have not made the assumption that, well, there's a very good chance that this individual is a serial rapist, so we have to investigate that individual. Now, when we start doing that, all kinds of databases obviously become of paramount importance. There are many avenues, ways that we investigate an individual that have nothing to do with databases, but certainly databases are extremely important. And of course, this gets us back to the testing of rape kits and why creating databases and populating those databases with as much information as possible is all to our advantage, because somewhere at some point, an investigator, this individual is going to pop up again, and we want that investigator to have access to all the evidence that they can access. And those of you who prosecute cases, I don't know if there are any prosecutors on the list this afternoon, but getting even a second victim in an investigation profoundly alters the complexion of the investigation and of the prosecution. Now, in the civilian criminal justice system, of course, the prosecution is still going to be, you're going to, these cases are going to be severed. You're going to very more than likely have to, try cases individually. In the military system, of course, that is not the case. The military system, cases will be combined into a single court-martial. But even in the civilian system, when you get a second victim, defense attorneys become much more amenable to talking deals, and deals that obviously would be much more favorable to the prosecution than otherwise. So the investigation and the search for additional victims is an absolutely crucial part of these cases, and something that we've got to start doing routinely. I can see I'm kind of running out of time here, so I'm going to move fairly quickly over. These are just some additional studies. These are relating to college campuses, again, underscoring the serial nature of sexual assault. So the two studies that I looked in detail at, the study that we did at UMass Boston and the Navy study, are really the two studies in that kind of non-stranger environment that have really documented the phenomenon in most detail. But there are many other studies that have documented sort of aspects of the phenomenon. So this study by Christine Gittich in 2009 was another documenting of the phenomenon. Back in 2002, Wheeler et al. Found the mean number of rapes by serial offenders was 6.5. So again, that seems like that magic number. In that age range, around the early 20s, the average number of rapes appears to be in neighborhood of 6. And this longitudinal study by Jackie White and her colleague documenting another phenomenon that is very familiar if you are familiar with sex offender research, sex offender research and the backgrounds of sex offenders. Again, just pointing out that even though we're looking at college students, we're actually looking at the same phenomenon of individuals who have the characteristics and the background that we're very familiar from many years of studying sex offenders. There are also community studies. I mentioned earlier, I alluded to Abel and his colleagues, study published in 1987, 126 rapists committed 907 rapes. Weinrot and Saylor, slightly smaller sampler, but the same type of study. These were adjudicated perpetrators, 37 rapists who've been charged with 66 rapes, admitted to 433 rapes. And we have much data from sex offender programs that mirror this. And just very quickly, this is a pattern that we've known about for a long time. This is a study published back in 1990, finding that the vast majority of violence in any community is perpetrated by a very small percentage of that community. So again, it's a phenomenon that we're very familiar with. I don't have time really to talk at length about some of these specific cases. This is a case from Albuquerque, Chandra Kennis, but it's I'll just say this about the case. It began much like a typical non-stranger case. The initial report was so sort of ambiguous. It really looked like it was going nowhere. Only by accident did the investigation really initially begin, and it resulted in ultimately 9 victims of sexual assault being identified, and is a sort of a classic example of a serial case that were it not for, actually in this case it was simply an accident, but were he not, Chandra Tennis not investigated thoroughly, we would never have uncovered these other victims of sexual assault. I want to spend a little time talking about a specific case I mentioned earlier. This was an Army case, and in this case, the victim had virtually no memory of what had happened to her. So to this day, I still believe that there was very, very likely some drugs administered, some kind of drug administered. She had spent some time in a bar with some friends, but the amount that we did a very intensive investigation to determine how much she had drunk, and it certainly did not look like it was enough to essentially create the kind of total blackout that she experienced. So the challenge then was there was physical evidence, but she had virtually no memory of what had happened. And so what happened is they fortunately were very diligent in swabbing and sending those swabs off for DNA analysis. And it's the DNA analysis that actually gave us a map of physically what had been done to this individual. And I don't have time to go into the details. We actually were able to get evidence, sort of very interesting. Much of the evidence that we were able to get was from a very, very detailed, careful evaluation of the victim. And even though she had no declarative memories, for those of you who are not familiar with cognitive psychology and memory, basic memory theory, declarative memories are what most people think of as normal memories, but what she had were implicit memories, essentially body memories. And through an evaluation, we were able to gather a lot more information about what had actually happened to her, because essentially her body was a map of what had been done to her. We got some compelling evidence from her husband, who witnessed her nightmares and so forth in the weeks and months after the assault. The long and the short of it was that the perpetrator, even though she had no memory, the perpetrator was convicted. And the DNA in that case permitted prosecutors to charge the multiple acts that had been perpetrated against this woman. She had been anally, vaginally, and orally raped, and that dramatically altered sentencing. So in a case that obviously looked very unlikely that it was going to be successfully prosecuted, it was, and it was a result of the DNA that individual was sentenced to multiple years at Fort Leavenworth. So,
wait, Dr. Lisak?
Yes.
It's also, I just want to interrupt you for a second and let you know that you can take more time. You know, we don't really have to hang up in an hour, and
okay.
People are staying on, and people can, you know, hang up as they need to. But I think I would love to hear more about some of these cases. So
okay.
I'll be
well,
able to.
I just have this. You know, there's one more case that I wanted to talk about. This is referred to as the Etherman case, or Etherman Rapist, also out of Albuquerque. This was an extremely vexing case. He was a serial rapist here in Albuquerque, and that's where my involvement in the case began. As I was essentially working with a detective it was cold at this point. He had raped individuals over a number of years, and we you know, did every kind of analysis possible to try to figure out you know, sort of what the pattern was, whether we could identify sort of where he lived, where he worked, something. It was clear that he was moving around. The DNA in this case was absolutely crucial. It was both his DNA and his modus operandi. So the DNA is the evidence that first linked, of course, this whole series of rapes across almost a decade in Albuquerque. And what he was doing was targeting mostly single women in neighborhoods near the University of New Mexico. And I remember we were trying to figure out, you know, sort of why was he targeting specific, you know, individuals. One of the things we discovered at one point was that he must have figured out how to jimmy the locks on a very specific type of window, because he was clearly picking houses that had that model of window. Houses, obviously, that also were houses where young women were living. We wondered, you know, was he a UNM employee? Why was he picking students and so forth? And then eventually he stopped and essentially disappeared off the radar. This case was finally broken years later. I was working with the APD on this, you know, back in, I guess 2003 and 4. Well, just a couple years ago, Robert Bruce surfaces in Colorado, and he was charged, and I can't remember what the offense was, by local police. I think it was up in Pueblo, Colorado, and he attempted to murder the police officer who was investigating that case. Fortunately, and this was a serious attempt, he was attempting to blow up the officer's house. They caught him, and then through DNA, they linked him to rapes not only all over Albuquerque, but in Oklahoma, in Austin, Texas, and very likely in other sites as well. And he's also an example of an individual who was a hybrid stranger and non-stranger rapist. So the bottom line of what these serial cases teach us is that this is very often the type of predator that we're going after. And one of the things that I'm sort of really heartened by is that there are an increasing number of jurisdictions. I was just up in Ashland, Oregon recently, and the detectives up in Ashland now have really instituted a real policy, and they have forms and procedures so that every time there's a sexual assault, they immediately begin not only an investigation of the incident, but also a deep investigation of this alleged offender. They start gathering documentary evidence. They start subpoenaing documents and getting access to email accounts and Facebook accounts. So they really tap social networks for information on this individual. And they do offline searches, NCIC offline searches. So one of the things that I was not aware of, this is one of the wonderful things when you get law enforcement really engaged in this. They're trained investigators and they understand things that I as a forensic psychologist don't understand. So an NCIC offline search is, as we all know, because these are interpersonal crimes, very few of them are reported. So there's the likelihood that you're going to have arrest records and so forth when you do searches on a suspect are very low. But an offline search allows you to find out, for example, has anybody ever done a search on this guy? And what that would tell you, of course, is some other jurisdiction, some other investigator somewhere was interested in this guy. And if you're investigating him, wouldn't you like to know what they were investigating him for? And so the NCIC offline search allows you to know that, and also to get the identity of the individual who did the search, and of course you can then contact that individual and find out what was the nature of that investigation and so forth. And there's the potential, obviously, there that leads you to additional victims, additional crimes. So there are many different avenues, many different databases, and just to circle back to the beginning, the rape kit and the biological evidence that's stored in that rape kit is one of the crucial databases. And since sexual assault is so much a serial crime, these databases are precious. And so my hope is that we become much more diligent in the future about maintaining these databases and much more diligent also about using them when we're investigating these crimes. With that, I'll stop and be ready for any kinds of questions that might be out there.
Okay, thank you so much. That was great. And a lot of people are asking, will this be recorded? And I have the same, I'm thinking, yes, I want to watch this again. And it is being recorded, and it will be available on our website. Give us a couple of days along with PowerPoint slides. I think we should have another, let's see, hold on one second. Let's see if I can find our last slide here. We'll have our website on it again. No, that's not it. Oh, I'll try to find that. It's victimsofcrime.org/DNA. We do have, let's see, a couple of questions. This one is thanking you for the wonderful work that you do, and I think we all agree. He says, I'm wondering if you can comment on the fairly recent UN report on sexual aggression in East Asia. Do you find that data to be essentially compatible with your core findings?
I'm not sure which. I did look at something, but fairly recently. But I'm not sure that I'm thinking about the same data that this questioner was asking about. So if somebody else wants to sort of identify what are the specific data that you're wondering about, whether that it's compatible, I'd be happy to answer that. But otherwise, I'm not sure that we'd be talking about the same thing.
I remember the information coming out, but I'm drawing a blank as well. So maybe. I'm missing the person's name here. Samuel, I think, could email us, and then we could have a conversation that way about the question. Another question, she says, I'm not sure if I missed it or not, but is there research to show the crossover between stranger and non-stranger rapists? I think this is a very question I got asked a lot.
Yeah. There are a little bit of data. From a researcher standpoint, it's not great, because of sampling problems, and there's just not much of it. Where you'll find it is in studies, largely from studies coming out of sex offender management programs. There's a lot of data that have come out of Colorado, especially because they mandate the use of polygraphs. So they've been sort of very diligent about trying to find out more about sex offenders, both in their programs and also sex offenders who are on probation. And if you look at those studies, you look at the kind of information coming out of those kinds of programs and research, that's where you'll find reference to this kind of crossover phenomenon. Other than that, unfortunately, it's really cases. It's you know, in those cases where we have serial offenders, where we really finally get to the bottom of it, and find out just how many individuals this individual has assaulted over how many years. It's in those situations that you find this crossover between not only actually between stranger and non-stranger, which we've just been talking about, but also crossover between child and adult victims, going both ways. So you have individuals who we may think of as essentially child molesters. We call them child molesters because we've arrested them or convicted them of molesting a child. And many of those individuals, we have pretty good data of this, and a lot of it out of Colorado again, that a large percentage of those individuals have also sexually assaulted adults, and vice versa as well. And there's also crossover between offenders who focus on their own children, incest offenders, and many times a lot of people assume that an incest offender is restricted to that, to family members, and that's not the case also. There's a lot of crossover to children outside the family. So I really recommend that everybody be familiar with some of that research, because this is one of the things that we all kind of get stuck on, where we tend to identify people, we label them, and then we think that somehow really describes them, when in fact these individuals tend to be predatory, and they will go after vulnerable people, and oftentimes their targets, who they're targeting shifts depending on who they have access to, and that's really the only thing that determines it.
I just lost the question, but essentially I'm getting this question a lot lately, and I've been working with several states on this. The question is about testing the unreported sexual assault kits. So the kits, where a victim can go and get the evidence collected, and then they have a certain amount of time to decide whether or not they want to make a police report. Some places are looking at testing those, going ahead and testing them. Do you have thoughts on that?
Well, from the standpoint purely of the sort of the efficiency of the criminal justice system and our investigations, of course I'm entirely in favor of that. Obviously, there are all kinds of issues that we have to be aware of and careful of. So, one of the reasons for this obviously would be if you do testing, and if you then can link this, let's say, past crime to a future crime, or just a crime temporarily may be before or after, but you link them at some other point in time, can you then go back to this individual who did not want to pursue investigation and ask the individual whether they would consider changing their mind? And this is something that I'm fully aware of how delicate this is, and we have to be very, very careful, obviously, about sort of, again, not adding yet one more reason for victims to shy away from the criminal justice system. On the other hand, I know of many, many cases, and oftentimes within the military, of where you have restricted and unrestricted reporting, where victims have been approached and have agreed to change from restricted to unrestricted because of this finding that there is an additional victim. And so, this is one of those things that I think can work actually very, very well if done right. And obviously there's some risk if it's not done right, that it can either traumatize or certainly put a victim in a psychological bind that we don't want to do.
Correct. I am thinking about trying to do a webinar on this, actually, because it's definitely an issue that's floating around out there for a lot of states, as many of them are looking at all their unsubmitted kits. So I think that might be something we could talk about doing. Let's see. What are your thoughts on using DNA profiles in lieu of names as the identifier on arrest warrants? So, John Doe warrants, those kinds of things. Do you have a thought on that?
I'm not sure I understand the question. In cases where there's the perpetrator or alleged perpetrator is unknown, and all we have is the DNA profile.
Correct. So you get a DNA profile from the lab. It's, a clear profile. You put it in the database. It doesn't hit to anything or to anybody. Potentially the offenders never had their DNA put into the database, either as a convict or an arrestee. And so what, places are doing, Cleveland's doing quite a few of these because they want to hold a statute of limitations on that case or suspend it basically for a little bit. So
well,
I'm in favor of it.
Yes, I mean, that's the obvious thing is of course the safeguarding the statute of limitations. The other two is the more extensive the database that you create, the more likely it is that somebody else in some other jurisdiction is going to tap into that database. And so if you have, for example, if you've indicted somebody or you've indicted a DNA profile, you create a larger database and just another avenue where some future investigator can make a hit. So I think there's an advantage from that perspective as well.
Has the number of rapists increased, say, from 20 years ago? Or are we able to track and convict them better because of the database?
Well, we have, again, as a researcher, it's a fairly easy question to answer. We simply have we don't have a baseline, and our methods and our methods of research keep changing. The most consistent data we've had is data gathered by the government, but for many, many years, the way the government was gathering the data was really so weak that I frankly don't feel like we have anything like the kind of baseline data that would permit us to, with any degree of confidence, essentially say one way or the other is the rate of rape increasing, the rate of child abuse increasing, is it decreasing? I just don't know. If it is increasing or decreasing, I don't see it increasing or decreasing, to a degree that is making much difference. We have an enormous number of victims out there.
Do you think that it's going to get better under the new definitions now for the federal statistics?
Well, I think yes. I think we are in the process of refining how we are gathering data, and going forward, we'll have the basis for having more confidence in the data that we are now collecting. So I think it becomes more possible in the future to start maybe answering some of these questions. Although I think we're probably going to get our most accurate data and findings not from sort of global national pools of data, but from intensive studies that are done on good samples, but smaller samples over time, because it just allows us much more control over the data that we're collecting.
Okay, let's see. We have just a couple more. Sorry, this is so small. Hold on 1 second. I can barely see this. Okay, so much of your research seems to focus on college student offenders. Have you seen much success in prosecuting these types of criminal cases, or have thoughts on their unique challenges?
Sure. The vast majority of college sexual assaults, of course, never make it into the criminal justice system. We know we have pretty good data on reporting rates, and reporting rates in the college environment are even lower than they are. They're lower than they are in the military. They're lower than in the civilian world, somewhere in the neighborhood of 5 to 10% maximum. Of those that small number of victims who do report, the vast majority will report only within the university system. So they will not pursue a criminal justice response. They'll pursue some kind of internal judicial response within the university, something that is, of course, causing an enormous amount of consternation of universities and colleges around the country who are, essentially because of this, forced to address sexual assault within a judicial context, and there's, it's simply, there's no way around it, but it is almost absurd because, as we all know, sexual assault is a serious, violent crime, and yet colleges are having to handle these cases. So, it's causing a lot of both consternation and trouble, but it's something that we have to tackle. It would be wonderful if more of the assaults that are happening on college campuses could be handled through the criminal justice system. But I think we're a long ways off from that. As I said, the reporting rates are so low. The willingness to go to the criminal justice system is there's so little of it that we have a lot of work to do. Yeah, I'll stop there because otherwise I'll just keep going on that.
Okay, let's take just one more. I think we're all just running. Actually, we had a couple questions about rehabilitation of sex offenders, and if you have any thoughts on that, about why it's so difficult, or there's any sort of successes that you have experienced or want to share.
Well, the bottom line, there's a lot of research on the efficacy of sex offender treatment and management programs. The bottom line is that a state-of-the-art, so a sort of well thought out, comprehensive sex offender management program that they're invariably multi-year, 3, 4, 5 years of sex offender treatment and management, and these can be done both for incarcerated, but also they can be done in the community, although most intensively they're done while the offender's incarcerated. And what we know is that these programs do reduce recidivism. Now, by what percentage, that depends on the study. It also depends on, of course, how long you follow these offenders once they've been released. And there are data that clearly show that the longer you follow them, the higher the recidivism rate. So one of the questions, the really vexing questions, is, well, are you finding a higher recidivism rate over time because over a period of years a higher percentage of offenders begin to reoffend, or is it simply that it takes years to catch up to the fact that they've been offending all along? These are really hard questions to answer. In fact, some of them are impossible to answer. The bottom line is treatment programs work. They don't work nearly as well as we would like, obviously. Some of the key questions really are which are the offenders who are amenable to treatment? Who can we really reach? And so there's a lot of research going into that now to try to identify those factors so that we treat individuals who have the capacity to change and who are likely to be, sort of be able to control their behavior, and we don't waste our resources on offenders who are unlikely to. And that will certainly increase our efficiency. As to why it is so difficult, I think this comes back to this whole issue that we've been focusing on, at least I've been focusing on, with the serial nature of sex offending. So when somebody has been engaged in these kinds of behaviors from the time they are adolescents, this becomes very, very entrenched, and it just is very difficult to alter this kind of very entrenched behavior, and it requires a very concerted effort over a long period of time. And the other thing about successful sex offender management programs is that they're called management for a reason. Is that yes, we do treatment. We try to alter the way these men, most of these are men, obviously, the way they think, the way they feel, the way they behave, and so forth. So we try to alter them internally, but then we also then impose all kinds of external controls, monitoring of various types, because we're aware of the fact that we can't rely simply on internal controls. So it's very challenging. I have an enormous amount of respect for people who are engaged in this work. As you can imagine, it's very thankless work, and there's almost no other line of work where you can do your job beautifully and have a 99.9% success rate, and the one failure will be the one that destroys your program, because of course these events are so serious that the public has no tolerance for any kind of error rate. So it's a really challenging area to work in.
Okay, well, we have so many more questions, but I think probably we need to close up now. If everybody can take the poll again, this is our post-test poll right to the right of your screen. That would be great. And also before we, when you log off, you'll see a window pop up that is for our evaluation. If you could fill that out as well, that would be great. I want to thank you so much, Dr. Lisak, for doing this. I feel like we could, we could do hours on this, and there's so many related issues that we could go over with you. So I really appreciate you taking time to do this. The webinar, again, was recorded. It will be online soon. Several people have asked me about certificates of attendance, and we will have those. You can just email me. I can send those to you by email. If you have any questions that you didn't, there's a lot that we didn't get to. Feel free to email me the question, and I can see if I can email them to Dr. Lisak, and we can try to respond to you that way. So thanks again for listening, and I hope everybody has a great afternoon.